So quick question. How many of you in the room have used a prototyping tool before, or one of the tools maybe listed up here? Just like raise your hand. Oh my, that's awesome. I actually didn't expect that. That's really, really great. I'm super excited to facilitate a conversation about these tools and why they matter for us. And actually, while we're talking, I want you to think about questions at the end, because I will say there's not been a lot of questions, so just prepare now and like write down little doodles or notes of things. I'm totally going to just hope that there's amazing questions afterward. The first thing I wanted to point out was that you'll notice on this panel, there's not really any representation from traditional design tools you might have thought about, right? There's not anyone here from something like Photoshop or Sketch, even though we spend a lot of time in those tools. These are all people who've created interactive tools. Yet we still chose to call the panel design tooling and not something like prototyping to kind of make a statement about where we think these tools are headed. We really think it's the next evolution of the medium of the tools we use and what we work on. So I think we've used static mock-making tools for a while, and they worked really, really well in a world where we were creating things like business cards and book covers and posters. But now with our devices, we touch, we drag, we swipe, we play. In some cases, we speak with our devices. And yet, we're using tools that don't necessarily represent that, right? We're using these flat, static tools, and I think it's mostly because it's easier, right? There's not really much of a better option. It's just it's the best that we have. And I think what I'm excited about is I think that's starting to change thanks to a lot of the people you see here. So I think a common scenario that might sound kind of familiar to many of you is you're in a meeting room, some combination of maybe product managers, engineers, and designers, and you're looking up at a screen, right, in some kind of room, and that screen has a picture of a phone on it, and that picture has a bunch of pictures inside of it, and you're kind of clicking through a bunch of different mock-ups. And you're making some pretty important decisions at that point sometimes, right? You're starting to kind of critique things, the way things look, the way things are placed. But it kind of feels productive. You're making decisions. You're making trade-offs. And at a certain point, you make enough of those iterations that you decide, OK, it's time. Let's hand it off to engineers. So you hand it off to engineers, and in a couple of weeks, or depending on the size of the product you're working on, maybe a few months, you finally get this demo. And you get this demo in your hands, and finally, your eyes kind of start to light up, and the conversation starts to change a little bit, right? All of a sudden, we're not focused on the pixels that were off on the projector, but we're talking about the flow in our hands, and we're having a productive conversation at this point. And unfortunately, sometimes, at that point in the process, you might realize a lot of those decisions you made weren't as good as you thought. And it's expensive to make changes at this point. You've made a lot of assumptions. You've built this whole thing. It sucks to have to go back on that. And I've actually seen this happen all the time at Google, and it's something we're actually trying to work on and get a lot better at. And fortunately, we can, because today, again, we have these new tools that allow us to skip to the feel part a lot sooner. And I think even without like a CS degree or staring at kind of a monospaced wall of text, right? We have these more visual tools now, and we can make things interactive in a matter of days instead of waiting months, which I think is really important. So thanks to a lot of these new tools like Form and Pixate and Origami and Framer and Envision, we can hand around our devices and ask people to try it, as opposed to just kind of imagining and making a lot of assumptions and filling in the gaps in your own way. But even with all of this explosion of all of these new tools, there hasn't really been a lot of conversation about it. There hasn't even been really like a whole lot of press or articles on the subject. I read one by Pascal da Silva that felt pretty good, but it was one of the only ones I could find about these tools, these interactive tools. And so we're really excited to actually have a conversation about these things. And I hope that it inspires us to continue to have conversations about the tools that we use and how it affects our process, how it makes better products. And so to start this conversation, we're going to go around and introduce ourselves and maybe just say your name, where you're from, and how you, just to start with something light, how you came up with the name for your product, and if there were other names you had considered beforehand. And so we'll start with Adam because his tool's name is particularly appropriate for the conference we're at today.
Cool. Hey guys, my name's Adam. I work on Form by Relative Wave. Thanks for coming to our conference. Really excited. Google got to sponsor it. Our first code name for the project was called Tango. And going along with the line of Google taking our product names, Google announced Project Tango, and we couldn't use it anymore. So we went to Form because for the longest time, our ethos for the project was, how do we make a tool that's really malleable? How do we make a tool that survives 15 years down the line? And we kind of see Form as kind of transcending mobile phone prototyping and doing something down the line. So,
Awesome.
Hi there. My name is Paul Colton. I'm the founder of Pixate. I was actually born outside of Venice, Italy, but lived most of my life here. For us, how we came up with the name, I actually came up with the name before we even knew what we were going to build. I knew it was going to be about pixels in motion, if you will. I knew that much. Pixar.com wouldn't sell me their domain, so went ahead and went with Pixate. Interesting side note, it was an Apple employee that sold us the domain he was holding personally. And the other interesting part, just I thought I'd throw out there, is we use 99 designs for our little flower logo. And it was interesting getting back 600 or 700 logos and whittling it down to one. So I feel like it was kind of community-driven for us. And then that, essentially, we used that name for the product that we were going to build.
Cool. Well, I'm Koen. I make Framer. And well, the story about our name is very boring, so I'll keep it short. There's a guy here in the audience, and he told me, you should call it Framer. It's a cool name. I liked it. So that's kind of what we settled on.
Hey, I'm Brandon Walken. I'm a product designer at Facebook. Worked there for about 5 years, and I built origami while working on paper. So I was part of a team there, and we worked on it for 2 years, and I basically built origami in my spare time while working on that. And in terms of the name, I think actually Noah's roommate, who's one of our design managers named Austin Bales, came up with the name. And yeah, I think we just wanted to reference two things. One, craftsmanship, right? And another is, so origami played a big role in designing paper. And so we thought it'd be pretty cool if there was some consistency between the names there.
I'm Clark from InVision. You might know me from Brooklyn or maybe your inbox. We invented InVision at a consulting company that I ran before for InVision. And we invented it. Is this the question I'm supposed to be answering?
Yeah.
Yes, we invented it to solve the problem of socializing the design process. So we felt like things were broken. Too many of the design conversations we were having were one-on-one, and we wanted to allow people to be included in the vision of the product. I may have just made that up. I'm not sure.
Awesome. So we're going to just kind of take you through a couple of themes and questions within those themes that we think capture some of the problems we're trying to solve and some of the interesting topics that we're going to go over. And to start, just kind of we want you to hopefully come away with this thinking about why this matters, and if you haven't already tried these tools, why you might want to. And so I guess just to get things started, let's go around and talk about some of the inspiration for creating your tool, like what drove you to do it. And actually, we'll start with Adam and kind of go along in the same way.
Cool. Yeah, we started working on the tool about a year and a half ago, so time flies. It's crazy that we're here on stage. We were working on a client project at the time, and we were building this 3D model editor for this client who wasn't overtly technical. And it was very difficult conveying the concepts in just PNGs. So we would send her a PNG on her iPad, and she would be zooming in and out, not understanding how the interface worked. And I played around with ways of making or trying to convey what I was trying to do with the 3D model editor, and just sending the client an MP4 showed the result of what we wanted to create, but didn't let you actually interact with it. So we tried to build a tool just for ourselves, and then we quickly realized, as I was just talking to friends in the industry, that this is a very common problem that a lot of people have.
How about you, Paul? How did you guys, what inspired you to create Pixate? What are the things that led to you guys creating this?
Literally before we wrote a line of code, we said, we're not going to try to guess what we need to build. We went out and spoke with many of you, honestly, just every designer who would have our meeting, Twitter, Pinterest, and a whole list beyond. And we said, what are your pains, and how can we fix them? And I'll just mention two real quick that I'm sure all of you, have. When I personally heard things like, we make After Effects movies, so then we can show that to somebody about what we intend, I don't know, I cringed about that, because I was like, well, what if you have to make a change? And how do you make variations of this movie? Can you interact with that? Of course, we know the answer to all of those. And then the other thing we heard was, oh, we hand it to engineering. Engineering spends 3 weeks prototyping an idea, only to have someone say, doesn't work. I mean, that's, to me, was like, I felt their pain. I wanted to run out of the meeting and start implementing. But we talked to lots of companies, and we literally just set out to build exactly what they needed. And that's effectively what we've started with, and we're going to keep going from there.
Nice. And how about Kuhn? Yeah, what inspired you guys?
Yeah, so for us, there's actually kind of two parts to this story, and the first part is pretty close to Brendan. I was also working at Facebook, not on paper, but on other stuff. And I was also trying to invent a way to just do better and faster work and iterate faster on ideas. So I found a way to sort of hack together existing technologies that we knew, like Photoshop and JavaScript, and get that done quickly. And it stayed like that for quite a while until I left Facebook. And after that, we started thinking about like, what are the biggest problems with that for designers to actually pick this up and start using. So how do we get designers to start learning code? How do we get this sort of framework to give you live, direct feedback? And that's what we tried to solve in this sort of second coming of Framer, and that's where we are now.
Yeah, well, the first time I started using Quartz Composer was actually when Mike Mattis joined Facebook. He brought Quartz Composer with him, and he was just building these incredible prototypes, things we've just never seen earlier. And it was just totally different from the work that we were doing at the time. So we saw that, and we're like, OK, we have to get to that level. This is where everyone's going to be in a few years. And so at that point, we started using Quartz Composer. And Quartz Composer is this really old tool. It wasn't even built for prototyping. And so we found a lot of inefficiencies in it, and just started building UI design abstractions on top of it. And we built it for ourselves while we were designing paper. We had all these ideas, and we wanted to actually get them out in prototypes. And so, yeah, we actually built Origami to do that. And then we just wanted to share that with the world. And so we shipped it.
So we developed Envision in an answer to, I think, a couple of conspiring factors. One was, I think, that designers were engaging with kind of some of the more, what were traditionally looked at as kind of academic approaches to design, like usability testing and real user testing, and kind of some of the things that people tend to do when a product's already been launched and they're trying to figure out what to do with it next. People were doing that during the design process, right? And people were engaging their end users, their stakeholders, in kind of the multiple networks of stakeholders, not only the main product leads, but also, of course, real users and VPs and domain experts. And we needed a place to allow all of that conversation to happen. And we needed a really low investment way for the product to iterate and to evolve in a process of kind of design discovery, in reaction to that. So we wanted to make sure that whatever tool we built required very little investment from the designer and was extremely flexible the whole way through, so that the story could really come through.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear even a little bit of contrast in the backgrounds of how each of these people made their tools. You're having some that are sort of more observational, right? You're going and interviewing various designers, learning about the problems they're having and how to fix them, and you can kind of step back. Maybe you have your own understanding being designers on the panel, but it can be different than maybe you see your own problems that you're facing and you're solving them for yourself. Yet we still kind of end up with a somewhat similar result and seeing this need for being able to prototype faster. So the next thing I want to ask is, why did it take up until now? Honestly, I think even 3 years ago, at most, people might have prototyped a little bit with some web code, or maybe used Keynote, and I think a lot of people still do. But a lot of the tools that you guys represent up here are pretty new. And what do we think took so long to make that happen? I know, Paul, you had some thoughts on this.
Yeah. Actually, we were chatting last night or this morning. It's all a blur now. But the idea is, how could it be that all of a sudden we're all here on stage? I didn't know about these guys when I started. I mean, seriously, and I mean, it's awfully interesting that how could we have all these different ways of prototyping and all converge to this point in this room today? And I rewound and I thought about everything, and long story short is, I think it had a lot to do with the whole skeuomorphic shift to flat design, right? If you think about it, we all spent all this time nudging a pixel to get that perfect texture, or that perfect shadow, or whatever it might be. And frankly, how the user interacted with that perfect look, if you will, came second. I think is when Apple kind of threw that out, frankly, shifted to let's keep things flat, but now let's focus on the experience a little more, the motion and the actual interaction. All of a sudden, that put it front and center. So it's no coincidence that for us, when we went out, that was the pain point. No one said to me, how do I make a better texture for my mobile app? That was gone, right? What came to me is, how do I get this nuanced interaction completely, precisely how I want it to be, and how do I do that without investing a lot of time in engineering and design, frankly? Or at least can I iterate my design of the interaction many times over? Because I always like to say, by the way, designers like to iterate. They need to. Engineers do not. They do not want to rewrite their code over and over. And I think that's fundamentally the big shift, basically.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, when I started seeing a shift was when we actually shipped chat heads in Facebook Home. It was funny, like, before that, I was trying to tell everybody about Quartz Composer, right? I'm like, oh, it's this amazing tool. It looks crazy, but you can actually use it to build like these really cool interactions that you otherwise couldn't. And no one wanted to hear it. But yeah, when we shipped Facebook Home, it had a bunch of pretty interesting interactions in there, and all done in Quartz Composer. And then I think one of our design directors, Julie Zhu, wrote a blog post where she kind of talked about some of the design process, and she mentioned that the whole thing was done in Quartz Composer. And so that's when I saw this like immediate shift where people started like thinking about interactive tools. I think that was like a big change there.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the actual creation experience. So the experience of opening up one of these tools and creating something, and how the difference between these tools might actually affect the outcome of what you're producing, right? They're very different if you've used each of these. Some of them are more visual, some of them are code-based, right? They have a different approach to how you might do it. So to start, there's no one on the panel that really works on like a timeline-based tool. No one here really, something like Flash or After Effects. Like, why don't we think, is there a reason for that? Why don't we have timeline-based tools versus something more free-form?
Well, if you're building an interactive tool, then time is not a constant, right? Stuff is like state is shifting throughout time, and it can have like go through different states every time that you use the app and stuff like that. So a timeline isn't very efficient if you're trying to build these longer interaction, maybe just to show off a small thing. And I think like that's the most obvious reason that wouldn't be the best model to pick for these new tools.
But why do we think that even with that being the case, a lot of people, at least in my experience, just kind of, and even seeing at Google, are gravitating still to the timeline-based tools? What is it about them that are making people use them?
Well, I mean, a lot of people build up knowledge around these tools, and I think they do particular things very well, and they're still very valuable. It's not that we're gonna, move After Effects out of the market with our interactive tools. I think they're gonna live sort of next to each other, and we'll slowly start taking more of the stuff that they're really good at and taking that into our apps, I think.
I think one thing I'll add is time, at least for interaction, implies the exact flow that your user is going to take. Right? Interaction by definition means it's random, and I think that's fundamentally why timeline doesn't work. And you can imagine, we've been asked countless times, put a timeline in there, and we're like, interaction is not about timelines, right? You can't dictate what your user's going to do. They might reverse the order in which they move their finger. You're not going to know that ahead of time.
Yeah, like one of the big things in Form is we were debating this internally, whether to do timelines or something a lot more interactive. And we thought that removing as much abstraction as possible is really important when you're trying to think of new ideas. Because if you conceive of an idea in After Effects and you load it on your phone and you can't actually interact with it, there's a level of telephone that you give to the engineer. Versus a system that works exactly like it would in production lets you actually tweak like little variables as you're using it. So we have this like silly thing where if you're dragging around an image, you can actually adjust like the spring friction when you're dragging the image. Or you could have like 3 iPhones, and they could all have people interacting with it with different amount of springs. It's really difficult to like fine-tune stuff like that when it's a pre-baked movie.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm wondering though, like, you know, how do these UIs actually, particularly for form and origami, that a lot of people have mentioned, they feel one of the reasons they haven't, you know, tried it out yet is maybe there's a bit of a learning curve. It's a different way of thinking. It's something that they haven't done yet. How do we help that a bit? How do we, you know, teach people this new tool? Is it the right UI, or do you think your UIs might change over time?
Yeah, I mean, so it's worth noting, like, origami looks the way it does because, you know, it's an extension on Quartz Composer, right? Like, I wasn't given a team of engineers and people to go and like make a tool from scratch, right? It was just something I had to build like in a scrappy way in my spare time just because I needed to do it. And so that's definitely why it looks the way it does. But I mean, in terms of like, what I think is actually really important is the fact that you can build anything in Quartz Composer, right? Like, it's completely unbounded. And I think that's important because when you're trying to be creative, you actually might want to do something that the maker of the tool hadn't thought about, right? And if you can't, you know, get those ideas out there, you know, it's a huge problem. So I mean, I do think there are definitely huge problems to like the Quartz Composer interface. It's intimidating. A lot of people find it confusing, and yeah, there's a bunch of other issues as well. But yeah, so I think if I were to start from scratch, it would look way different, but it would still have that capability to let people build anything that they can imagine.
I think there's a really interesting contrast there between what you're mentioning, which is like you have this kind of free-form canvas, right? In the same way that you have this big canvas in something like Sketch or Photoshop, you have almost a blank page and you can create anything. But with that comes a little bit of hesitation, right? Everyone has that little bit of like, you know, blank page, you don't know where to start. And I'm excited by the contrast on this panel because I find something like InVision, for example, you know, there's more constraints to it, right? There's a little bit more, if you've used it, it's a little bit simpler for you to get going. There's not the same kinds of, you know, questions from customers that I've heard about that are saying, I don't know how to start with this tool. But on the other hand, how does that affect what you can create? This one, for example, you know, you can tie together screens a lot easier, and you can, you know, allow things to slide left and right or up and down. How have you found the approach of having a simpler, like, approachable tool versus a more flexible one?
I think I look at product design as being 3 different dimensions, right? So there's the aesthetic dimension, the interactive dimension, and then there's the story, right? So with any of these products, the focus of the product kind of biases you towards a focus on one of those dimensions, right? So with InVision, the focus is story. We all agree on aesthetics. I think we're all, you know, we're not wireframing tools, right? So we all agree that you need aesthetics to be able to have a broad reach with your user engagement. But if the story is why the user showed up, and the story is where you want to bring them in the end, right? I look at that as being fundamentally different than engineering an interaction, right? Which I think is also important. But I think it's something that has to happen after the story has been nailed down, because most of the business strategy, which is really what we do, I mean, that's, you know, as designers, and I think this is also conspires with the whole changing role of designers and designers just doing more, being more involved, and taking a greater leadership role in the product design process, and even a strategic and business level. But when you're there and you're thinking about what the business needs, the story has to be primary, right? The interactions are there as an accompaniment to the aesthetics to create comfort as the user responds to the system, right? Which is also important.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, just you know, from our take, you know, I don't think you don't require complexity to build something complex, and I think, you know, think of a pencil. I mean, it gives you complete creative freedom. Yeah, it's one of the simplest tools you could have. I think for us, that's been our approach. How can we build the absolute simplest tool to then also absolutely not hamper any creativity? And to touch a little bit on your point too, I think also for all of us is, I think we strive, I'll speak for everyone, that at least we do, we strive that our tool doesn't influence what the final product's going to be like. You know, that's when we know we failed. If everything you build looks like it was built in Pix8, then we've done something wrong, right? We want to make sure that the end result looks like what you wanted to build, and we were just that pencil that made it happen.
Yeah. Just to add on to Brendan's point, sorry I cut you off, Kuhn. One of the big things that we focused on with the open canvas, the fact that you can build anything, is it's a great amount of difficulty. So you first open up form, blank canvas. It's really intimidating. The main thing that we focused on while designing patches is how do we make this the most consistent system possible. And because everything is consistent, there's only outputs and only inputs, data flow is always the same way, you can build a lot of reusable chunks. So you can build your own patches. And because you can reuse a lot of it and you can build your own patches, the canvas actually ends up shrinking a lot. And because it's actually a very concise canvas, it makes it very easy to parse. And because it's parsable, you can actually, well, because you can build anything, you can actually build like a hamburger menu patch if you really wanted to. And it's still made out of the same 20 patches that Form ships with.
One thing that's starting to come up that I'm curious about is, Clark had mentioned that, there's a big emphasis in Vision for storytelling. And at other points of our conversation here, we're talking a bit about moments of, openness and execution. Is there a point in the process, in the design process, that you think your tool is meant to be used in? Can it be used at any point? Are your tools all possible for storytelling in a higher level? Like, is it just about execution, polish, and detail?
Well, I think that sort of ties into the flexibility of your tool, right? So, for example, if you would take the linear approach for any of these tools, you would be like pretty much confined in this one thing, like this micro interaction. But once you get to a code or visual or a signal flow programming, you can do anything. So it's pretty, like in Framer, it's not easy, but it's like doable to set up really huge apps, basically build entire applications in there. So for us, I think we often get defined as sort of like a micro interaction tool because you focus on these small things, but it's actually, I think we're one of the few tools where it's possible to build out entire app experiences.
Yeah, go for it. OK. Yeah, so at Facebook at least, we start using Quartz Composer really early in the process. So whether it's like a new app that we're thinking about, when we go and pitch this to Mark, he's expecting to see like a full prototype that is polished, that has animations, that has interactions, that's thought through. And obviously, like sketching plays a role. Like we all have sketchbooks and draw. It's very low friction to do that. But yeah, I think it really does help tell the story when the thing that you're showing looks like how it will actually look to users, right?
I think there's a pretty major caveat there is that investment is the enemy of creativity. The more you invest in any particular direction, the more biased naturally you are to moving ever further in that direction, right? So when you're dealing with these multiple layers of abstraction, you have your design and you have your interactive components, and maybe you have two different tools. So you're in Photoshop and you're in one of these tools. You have to be very careful that you don't end up down a rabbit hole that just makes you either personally resistant to the change that you'd like to make, right? Or the changes that happen as a natural process of discovering, what the user really needs. And I think that there's also a really important, philosophical difference between articulation and discovery. So if you have an idea, if we took, let's say Facebook paper or something, and we knew that we wanted to take that animation and design it, to engineer it, to make it look exactly like that with all the subtle nuances, right? That's a certain process, that's a certain domain, right? If you're not sure what you want, right, and you know that the user came from point A and they're ending up at point Z, and there are all these different points in between, and you want to understand how to kind of deal with the gentle volley of interaction with that user, I think that you need to stay really flexible because 3 screens in your app could turn into 1, or 1 screen could turn into 3, depending on the direction that you make strategically.
Yeah. I'm gonna move things along just a little bit, just so we can make sure we touch on one of the topics that I think we talked to be about. One of the most interesting things we look at is where is this really going? Is it going to be one of these tools that we end up using predominantly in the same way you could argue something like Photoshop or Sketch has done, right? There's not a huge amount of disparity in the tools we've used in other contexts, yet here, these tools are very different, and you have a lot of choice now, and in some ways you can almost find that paralyzing as a way to start. And so just as kind of a final topic to touch on, let's start with, is it going to be one tool? Do you think that it's just one of us like standing after this or something, and it's just going to be one tool you approach? Or is it a combination of these things? Can you use these things together? Yeah, where do we think this is going in that sense?
I think it's good to have choice, finally, as designers. We've been coming from, some, I don't know, 5 to 10 years where if you were designing, you were probably using Photoshop, and everybody around was using Photoshop. So I'm pretty happy to get rid of that. Although Photoshop is a nice tool, but I'm also pretty sure that all the different directions, it's weird that we all have such different approaches, right? From UI-based to visual programming to actual code. And I think the real tool in the future will probably be a blend of some of those in a really smart balance, where maybe you give up some flexibility for a really low learning curve, or maybe not at all. We'll see, but I would definitely be surprised if in 5 years we would still be debating if visual programming would be better than code or better than a UI. That will solve itself over time.
I actually do think designers will be expected to know prototyping tools. Just like every designer is expected to know Photoshop or Sketch, and designers are really good at that, right? You can go on Dribbble and you can see a whole range of different types of visuals, right? You're actually not seeing that with interaction. What you normally see is, people will be really creative with visuals because they know how to, use those tools. But then when it comes to how the app is actually structured and the specific interactions, they'll pull stuff from some app that's out there, or maybe another app, combine them together. But you really don't see the same sort of creativity in interactions. And so I think once people start learning these new interaction tools, and once they become more advanced, easier to learn, easier to use, I think that's going to be huge.
If you really think about it, we've been talking and interacting with computers the same way for 30 years. It's been terminals and text, and they've been talking back to us through consoles. And there's been almost a sense of dogma laid down with how we actually build things. And for the first time, we're actually empowering designers to go out and essentially make their designs interactive, and we have no dogma right now. So it's really fascinating that we have WYSIWYG, visual programming, and textual-based programming. It's interesting right now that we have no expectations. I think that's why there's all these different directions.
I think the thing that's going to precipitate all of this change is the changing role of the designer. So I think we've seen a convergence around kind of everybody just generally describing themselves as a designer because nobody wanted to be just a UX person or just a visual person. I see in the future, and I see this happening now, even in companies in this room, where you have a product designer who really thinks more like a product manager, right? And I think product managers that also think like designers, and I think the best of both will probably have that kind of mindset, strategically driven, needs of the business kind of at the forefront, leadership skills, understanding how to engage end users, how to take a lot of feedback and sort it and throw away the stuff that isn't good, but interpret it empathically. And then perhaps people who are more focused on kind of the interactive layer, the more kind of the subtle nuances of an application. And I see those people sitting in the room as part of an ecosystem of how a product is designed in an open, kind of socialized way. What I don't see the traditional handoff process where a designer or a few designers go into a room, they build something, and then there's this cadence of design review, right? I think that humped design review cadence will flatten out, and the design that's being worked on will be socialized and more available and engaged beyond the design department, kind of through the life of the product development process.
Yeah, it's even interesting how these tools might affect our role in that process, right? And change the pieces in which we're involved throughout that cycle. We did want to just pause here for questions and see if there are anything that you guys were wondering that we can help answer. And there's people, I think, with mics that are walking around and can help you out. So I guess just raise your hand if there's something, a burning thing on your mind, and we'll go around. Oh my God, we have questions. So we've got, whoever's closest right over there, and then whoever gets the mic is going to be the one that gets to ask.
How do you guys feel, or what do you guys think about the dichotomy of tools that starts to emerge when you have a tool for visuals versus a tool for interactions, and maybe even a different means of how do you deal with data in those prototypes as well? Because I personally would love to have a tool where I can just go and just focus on one thing and kind of like design an entire product versus having to flip around through different tools depending on their strengths and weaknesses?
I'll just say, I think one challenge that we've tried to stay, for example, away from is anywhere away from your core product becomes a slippery slope. In other words, we were joking last night, next thing after square, you want a triangle, and now you're going to want a circle, and all of a sudden you want sketch, right? And on the other end, now you want a timeline, now you want compositing, and now you have After Effects. The problem is, how far do we keep going? I think for us, what we've decided to say is, there's a big gap in the workflow right now, regardless of the tool you pick, for your processes of building these interactions. That's the hole we're trying to fill, right? We're trying to say, you've designed over here, and you want to deliver over there. There's a big hole in the middle. We're going to fill that hole. I think we, at least speaking for Pixay, we have to be careful we don't keep slipping more and more into, oh, by the way, now we're your design tool, now you're a pixel editing tool, we're your deployment tool. You know what I'm saying? I think, so there's a give and take, basically. I don't think one tool can do it all. I don't think you want one tool to do it all, because if so, you wouldn't have Sketch. So
I think aesthetic authoring will happen in the desktop, probably in the incumbent tool set, Photoshop, Sketch. But I think that the process of bringing that to life and kind of moving that through time, right, in an interactive way, which really prototyping is just a storytelling tool, but I see that converging in one place.
Let's take another question just to make sure we get a few more out there. Yeah, whoever you guys want to walk up to, it's closer to you.
Oh.
There you go.
Last time I used a visual prototyping tool, it involved a lot of logic and decision making that normally doesn't happen until you get into code. And that sort of gave me this grandiose vision of one day maybe we'll be able to build apps completely through some of these prototyping tools. How far away do you think we are from that happening?
I think we're sorry. I think we're very, very close. The reason Form took so long is our foundation is you could actually run these compositions in production. That's something that we're working toward, and it's not that far out. So even though it's very challenging and there's a lot of logic, some of that, unfortunately, is necessary to cover all the edge cases. So there is a very short-term future where you can just do like file export and load it up in Xcode and give it to your engineer, so there's no loss in translation.
I think also, I think generating code is very different than architecting software. So even if you have a tool that can spit out some code that's descriptive at a programmatic level of the thing that you see on the screen, how that ties together, frameworks, there's probably at least some developers in the room, right? It is way more complicated than just generating code. All of this has to be glued together. There has to be some infrastructure to tie it all together, and that takes hard decisions. And even how that happens is a very rapidly evolving process. It's a whole field, right? And so I think it would be really difficult for a tool to generate an app you could ship. And I think that'll probably be a silver.
I think there are all these complexities that you have to deal with when you're building an app versus what you actually want to be thinking about when you're prototyping. For example, when you're prototyping, it may not be worth the effort to make sure your prototype works in every single language or on every single screen size. That's going to take a bunch of time. And if it's not going to help you solve the problem that you're originally trying to solve, you don't want to do it. I think in addition to that, when you're building an app, say you're building an app for iOS, right? You probably want to use the system frameworks, right? You want to use UIKit. That gives you a bunch of benefits, it's immediately accessible. If you're visually impaired or hearing impaired, the app will just kind of work. And I think if the tool just sort of renders in its own environment, you're going to miss out on a lot of that.
Yeah. Now, having said that, I'm with Brennan. I think that it's too big and probably the wrong problem to tackle to go from your prototype to a final product at once. But there's a lot of in between that we can actually improve, I feel. I think a lot of you are still sending zip files up and down with resources to your engineers. That's kind of silly. We could do better than that. I think there's a lot of obvious stuff matching inputs for spring physics, maybe even mapping out positions like states that we can maybe send down to the iOS engineer that then also use a state machine and can reuse all that stuff. And I think that's the obvious stuff that we still have to solve and haven't, and that's what I'm going to try to focus on in the beginning.
I just have one warning. The minute you find yourself heading up the investment slope, all right? And the day you walk into a meeting with VPs or product people or your own team, and you're angry at the person who gave you feedback, suggesting that you should change everything, not because he's wrong, right, but because it means that you have to go and redo something you spent a week doing, be very afraid, right? That's not where you want to be.
We probably have time for about one more question. If there's more things, I think there were more hands than that. Feel free to either tweet at us or just find everyone during the happy hour later or something like that. But I think we have time for just maybe one more quick one. Yeah, wherever you are.
Hey. Alexander from Minbox. I have a question for all of you. I think it's amazing, all of these tools enabling all different types of content creation. But what ends up happening is that over the course of a project, all these different types of content get siloed into these services. So the more you use, everything gets fragmented and spread out. So I just was wondering what your thoughts were on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess it's a downside of choice, right?
Well, I don't mean like similar tools. I mean like each one of these tools that you use is specialized in a different way.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's come to the point where we're using 10 cloud-based tools right now. And we have to go to each one of these services to either export content and put it somewhere or host it and share a link. So I was just wondering, you know, if you guys think that's a problem or...
Thankfully, Adobe has actually acquired all these guys.
Yeah.
We're all merging, yeah.
Well, I think obviously integration with the other tools is important. I mean, obviously, like that's why earlier the point about rectangles and circles, I mean, it really isn't a joke. The point is we don't want to get into that stuff, right? The idea is you know how to, whether it be vector or bitmap based, you're doing that somewhere else. We're not asking you to redo anything. We're saying bring that in here, and when you're done, it'll go out to there, wherever that might be. I hear you, though, that movement of data is a pain, and hopefully I think either some of us already have, frankly, others have already dealt with import and exporting. We're looking to that and just continue to streamline the workflow, I think is the answer.
Yeah, and just I'm totally trolling at this point, but we have a JavaScript patch in Form, so you could just load a JavaScript prototype in our tool, but that's not going to help with your case.
Cool. I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for being here, and I hope this is again like the start of more conversations about these tools and what other gaps there are in our design process and how we can solve them with more tools. So yeah, thanks a lot, and we'll see you around. Thanks, guys.